So today I would like to present a documentary about the Montandon system of watch and clock spring calibration, and this was developed by Montandon frères, Paris, which existed in business between 1818 and 1905 when it was finally liquidated. However, the patents and know-how did continue to be applied on a commission basis until 1918. So this technology was adopted possibly in the early 1800s. The house was founded in 1790 in Libreville, and by 1818 they had opened up in Paris. And the two brothers, Louis Francois and his brother Henri Abram, also were the main founders. They established this system, which apparently became quite popular in Europe, and by the 1830s they had become a known commodity. Their technology was progressing at a very fast clip, and they were able to eventually move their enterprise from Paris to Rambouillet, where they established a much more industrial scale factory. And this was later mechanized with steam and a large line of very specific machine tools, of which they used to make clock springs and watch springs. Now the clock springs, for each spring that they produced, would require 45 separate steps in that process to get the eventual product, the final product. And for watch springs, up to 60 separate stages of production before finally receiving the end product. And the calibration system that they created became very popular, and as a matter of fact is still used today. This system must have been established prior to the 1860s. It's more likely that when they mechanized, they would have already needed to have a very precise methodology for measuring watch spring thicknesses and heights. And their system also accounts for the measurement of watch barrels for the mainsprings themselves. Now, I would like to show you a series of these gauges, which we find patented as probably as early as the late 1860s. We have references to patents for devices that measure various linear dimensions. And let us go to look at the actual gauges themselves. There's a lot of interesting information that we can find there. So before we examine the Montandon gauges and calibers, I would like to talk a little bit about the genealogy of the founders of Montandon frères Paris. Now, the branch of Blaise-Léon is the family branch we're speaking of here, and the sub-branch Montandon de Rambouillet, most likely the original founder was Daniel Francois Montandon Blaise-Léon, and he is born in 1772. It's very possible that it was he or one of his cousins of the Libreville Montandon Blaise-Léon group who started in horology. However, when we look at we continue to look at Montandon de Rambouillet, we will find the following. Now, there were 4 brothers, and I did reverse the order of Abram Henri previously, so that's a correction here. However, the main founders of Montandon frères appear to have been Louis Francois and Abram Henri. Now, both of them were made Knights of the Legion of Honor in France for their efforts at the watch spring production and clock spring production. Their factory employed well over 100, I believe it was 130 workers. Earlier in the history, we see mention of this Henri Guillaume, who died of cholera in Paris around 1832. And originally the business may have been registered under him, because we see that after his death in the 1830s, the firm was originally liquidated, and then it was reconstituted under the other brothers. The other brother that we have, Charles Auguste, we know very little about him, whether he was fully involved in the business or not, but he appears to have died young and without a male heir. So we are left with Louis-Francois and Abraham Henri. Now, Louis-Francois was possibly the main brother. It's hard to say who was more authoritative in the early business. He had one son, Ernest, who seems to have died at the age of 30, and it's not clear whether he played any role in the business. He may have had a minor role. However, Abraham Henri, who we have, now he was born in L'Abrevine in 1804, so therefore he probably moved to France when he was a teenager from Switzerland. And as the business did start in Paris in 1818 after the Napoleonic Wars, and his line will have been the one who carried on the business, most specifically Alfred Henry, and we find many of our calibers signed Alfred Montandon or A. Montandon Paris. And he also had a son, Albert Louis. It's not exactly clear which name he went by. In some cases it's as Albert, in others it's Louis, but this is not exactly clear, and it is also not clear whether he continued in any way in the watch business. It does seem that Montandon Frères did go extinct with the death of Alfred Henry in 1918. As I mentioned previously, the business had been liquidated in 1905. I believe the Rambouillet factory was sold in 1909 and demolished in 1910. Yet Alfred continued to sell pieces, springs, and equipment based out of Paris, and up until 1914, until the Great War, and then from 1914 to 1918 under a commissioner or a commissar who sold for a profit to himself, but as a representative. So now let us go to the interesting portion of our addressing. We see that in the very beginning, both Montandon Frères springs and the watch side, when they originally opened in business in 1818, they were most probably located at the same address. We don't have specific confirmation of this address until 1820, when we find the first French almanac, a commercial almanac, where the address of Croix des Petits Champs 34 is listed. And it appears that both sides of the business functioned from the same premises during the 1820s. However, there are some years in which the almanacs are missing. By 1827, we see that the watch spring side apparently has already moved to Poterie des Arcis, number 9, and this may have happened as early as 1824-25. It's not clear. On the watchmaking side, they were already relocated at Grenelle Saint-Honoré 14, where they would remain for a very long time. Now, another interesting note is that after the death of Henri Guillaume in the 1830s, we find that the watch spring site was located at Mont-Saint-Gervais number 9, and when by 1839 I believe the business was liquidated, and after this we find it relocated at François Miron number 8. There they would remain for a fair period of time. They did, by 1847, they had already established themselves in Rambouillet, also Rue du Hasard, number 8. And this is where the more highly mechanized factory was put in place. And this would be totally re-equipped with steam engine tools, which a specific line of very unique machine tools were created only for them. And at this time, they were the only large-scale manufacturer of watch and clock springs in the world, and they became in the number one place. They were basically recognized as the best watch and clock spring maker at this time, and their fame was known around the world. So this also is evident in the expositions, the World Fairs, Universal Expositions held in different cities around the world, where they are winning gold and silver medals for their springs. Now, another interesting thing, we find that by 1887, Alfred Montandon relocated from Rambouillet to Paris, and he appears to be at Oberkamp 18, where I believe he was living and working from the same place. I believe there were an upper and lower floor, and this address appears for many, many years. It had been previously owned before, probably by the father. We see it as far back as at least 1870, and actually, interestingly enough, at this address, there is a notice in a French newspaper, in the French press, that this Montandon and several others in his building donated money for a flag for a certain regiment. This was, of course, during the Franco-Prussian War, and they were trying to be patriotic in the face of this war and defeat that was happening for Napoleon III under the French Empire, it was known at that time. And so there's just a little background. I would like to now show some of the watch spring gauges. Now let's discuss the mainspring gauges themselves. Richard Watkins of Tasmania has conducted an exhaustive, almost forensic study of mainspring gauges and compared them. Now there are at least 6 systems in use. Of these, there is the Denison system, the Montandon system, the Robert system, and the Montandon system. There's also a Lepine system, amongst others. The most popular system appears to have been the Montandon system. However, the Robert system was used quite widely in La Chaux-de-Fonds. So the earliest mention of the watch spring calibration instrument we can find in a patent information from the late 1860s, and we see various different publications showing the Montandon calibration tools in the mid-1880s. Now we do have this one example. It is a calibre vérifié, verified caliber. This one is stamped Montandon frères, Alfred Montandon Rambouillet, and then S and O, that's Seine-et-Oise, the department. Now this and these are all made of brass. However, there seems to be a steel insert in this one. So this is most likely the oldest that I have discovered. It's most likely from the late 1860s until the mid to late 1880s. This is signed Rambouillet, and it's most likely prior to Alfred's departure in 1887 to Paris. Now, this can be used for the heights of the watch spring or clock spring, as well as the thickness. There are these circular patterns. These are for the spring barrels to determine the size. So now we associated with these watch spring gauges are various different ponçons or maker marks. Some are trademarks, and there are a variety of these, which I shall show. Some of these are, for example, such as Richard Watkins shows in his publication, the 1825 trademark of Montandon frères, which shows MF and then F, or backwards MF, and in the center is sort of a spring balance with a spring, and déposé for when it was presented to the patent office. So we also find often other marks, such as what appears to be an EF or FE, very ornately made. Some have suggested this is Empire Française or French Empire. I am of the opinion that this may indicate fusée, which is for a verge fuse piece, as opposed to the anchor or lever. So this is not exactly clear. Many of these are not exactly clear. Another ponçon that we find on these gauges is very ornate, very elaborately engraved PR, and this is a repetitive mark that we find on various different tools. For example, we have another which is a backward F and P. This also frequently appears on our gauges. And the this is a very different gauge that I'm holding. It is specifically only for the watch spring barrels, and it has up to 41 sizes. And this has both the elaborate EF or FE and the elaborate PR engraving. So this may have been for, it appears to be very small barrels, very small watch barrels. But this is most likely a newer tool, perhaps early 20th century. Now, the next gauge that I would like to discuss is this. It's entitled Échelle Montandon. That's the Montandon scale. And we see also AM Paris, and this is Alfred Montandon Paris. And this is probably made prior to 1887 when he relocated there. This is approximately around 1900, I would imagine. And with these gauges, now I mentioned they're all made of brass, and brass is a metal which has a tendency to suffer from oxidation, and as a result you will see a bit of darkening on the surface, and that's a patina which is formed because of the oxidation process, It can be very difficult to remove. Most of these gauges were recovered in a state with a very thick patina, virtually brown, dark brown, which had to be removed with various cleaning techniques. But it is very difficult to remove, and it's a symptomatic problem with oxidation taking place. Now, there are also other 20th century examples of the Montandon, échelle Montandon. Now, these were produced and probably are still produced. I can see in the 40s advertisements for échelle Montandon, such as the one that Charles Auguste Montandon, who was a watch tool seller in La Chaux-de-Fonds, and in his catalog we see the échelle Montandon for sale. So it's very interesting. And we also have a circular Montandon scale gauge, which is very interesting. This was acquired from Argentina, and it has very precise measurements for the thickness, but as well as the actual widths of the springs, watch springs. So this is a very interesting little tool. But yet it does appear that these have been continued to be produced, even though obviously the patent has expired long ago. However, this continues to be used and preferred now by many watchmakers. It's interesting because even today in Swiss watchmaking, they're still using this old linea system. And this Montandon system, one of the peculiarities of it is that it is based on the old linea system. And linea is French for line. So 12 linea were equal to 1 pouce, and 1 pouce is basically an inch. That's French for inch. So I also have a gauge based on the Martin system. Now this is a different system altogether, and on this Martin gauge we see the word lever, and this is for a lever piece, and it also it's interesting to see that in these different systems that they're marked in this way. Now, one Montandon gauge we find here clearly signed LV. This is probably an indication this is for lever pieces. Now, when I take the one gauge here, this apparently it's got much wider gaps, as you can see, and this is for most likely, this is another product altogether. This is Montandon Fusée. This is for verge Fusée pieces. The springs are much bigger, and this appears to be very similar, if not identical, to this Montandon Fusée, which is pictured in an 1885 publication, horological publication. So we do see specialized gauges depending upon the type of watch. Now, the Montandon frères, they had several different lines for different products. They had English and German pendulum clock, such as those made in England or in Germany in the Black Forest. They had very specialized measurements, and they produced also specifically for these different standards, like the Germans used, the English used, etc. But it's very interesting because they were selling their wares around the world, and for the longest time they were the main supplier of clock and watch springs. And it's very interesting that they were in business for nearly a century, that this is the product of 3, perhaps 4 generations in this family, and it's quite interesting to see the success which they attained at that time. So a little note on the history of the fabrication at the Montandon Frères spring factory. Now, the Montandon Frères Paris watch and clock spring atelier functioned from 1818 to 1844, essentially with the use of purely manual machinery. During 1844, the atelier converted 90,000 kilograms of Styrian steel, origin Austria, and 2,000 kilos of molten steel into 40,000 pendulum clock springs and 6,000 dozen watch springs. For this, Montandon Frères won a silver medal at the Paris Exposition. And moving the fabrication from Paris to Rambouillet was part of an effort to lower the production cost with the lower wages in the area south of Paris. So this transition to the new location was affected by 1847, and the newfound facility at number 8 Rue de Hazard in Rambouillet is discussed. A very interesting article by Christian Rouillet in Le Pays de Uvelin, and this article is entitled Quand Rambouillet avait du ressort. So Christian Rouillet notes that within 2 years, the Montandon Brothers factory was producing 70,000 springs for clocks and 20,000 dozen watch springs. This increased by 1866 to 800,000 clock springs and 180,000 dozen watch springs. They had offices in London and New York, which distributed these goods, as Montandon Frères became the largest manufacturer in the world. During this time, the watchmaking side was still in operation by the other Blaise-Léon cousins and their children in Paris. However, by around 1850, it appears that all of the cousins had made a final transition from Paris to Locle. But we do still seem to have this continued cooperation between the Montandon Frères Paris and Locle branches. Locle would become a center for watch production. And there was a little bit of a realignment. It appears to have taken place at this time. By 1863, Rambouillet facility had become too small for their operations, and the brothers acquired yet more land on the Boulevard Varennes in the quarter of La Pierrefitte in Rambouillet. And this location corresponds with the modern address of 49 through 55 Boulevard du Général Leclerc. And Christian Rouillet states that Louis-François maintained a private residence at the old Rue de Hazard location. The new operations at Pierrefitte would cover 2,000 square meters on a plot of 3 hectares, which was erected in the time period of 18 months. There they had modern steam machinery, which fitted the factory with a total power of upwards to 30 horsepower output. And this power was used to operate 75 machine tools, which they used in clock and watch spring production. These tools included unique solutions which were created specifically for their enterprise. The factory was also equipped with an oven for bluing steel. And the number of operations required in the fabrication of these wares varied. For clock springs, it would take 45 different operations, as I previously stated. This would produce springs with a diameter of 8 centimeters. These were sold for 30 centimes a piece. Likewise, with the watch springs, it would require 60 different operations to produce each spring. And these springs were realized at the selling price of 20 centimes, or 0.2 francs each. The workers of Montandon Frères Paris Rambouillet factory, there were approximately 130 individuals, and they consisted of men, women, and children. And these ouvriers, or workers, were paid a wage between 3.5 to 4 francs per day. Some earned upwards of 5.25 francs per day. The average wage for women was pegged to around 2 francs per day, and all workers were paid upon entering the factory. There were also funds put aside for the workers, which were paid into, and this fund helped support the workers overall. This was a common practice of that time. The fund was also supported by donations from leaders within the company itself, and these were rewarded to good workers or workers in need. These funds could be distributed basically for those deserving as a reward for a service that they had completed. So the workers were also registered with the Rambouillet Relief Fund. This is the Caisse de Secours Mutuel de Rambouillet, and there were special booklets that were opened in their name in the saving fund, this Caisse d'Épargne, when these were arranged for the workers. And it's also interesting to note that likewise Louis-François Montandon was the vice president of the Caisse de Secours de Rambouillet, and this demonstrated his vital role in the local community. Workers were urged to attend evening classes held by the Relief Fund, and even sang in a local choir. A large number of the workers at the Rambouillet Spring Factory were senior workers of 20 years or more by 1867. And the success of this usine Montandon Frères it proved to be very economically viable, and it was highly beneficial to the community and for the nation. And they were both brothers were awarded knighthoods of the Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur. So they were knighted as Knights of the Legion of Honor as a result of their success. Louis-François died by 1875, and his brother Abraham Henri in 1887. And at this time, Alfred Henry moved back to Paris. However, the Rambouillet factory continued its operations in fabrication. The eventual liquidation took place in February of 1905. This more or less is the date ending the high golden era in Montandon watchmaking and horology. And after this time, we see the early period of the 20th century as a period of decline in the brand's celebrity and output. Once again, after the liquidation of the spring factory, Alfred continued to sell with a representative who took commission, and this continued until 1918, after which time we see that the brand disappeared. Incidentally, in May 1905, the assets of the firm were sold to Charles Auguste Bertin, and Alfred Henry at this time was trading in Paris from de Bellume 15. So he slowly went into a retirement. He had a large estate in Finistère on the coast, the Atlantic coast, in Plogasnou area, and he lived there until his death in 1918. We also have a very interesting publication after the 1867 Paris exhibition, and this is published in a report by Claudius Saunier, Exposition universelle de de l'industrie en 1867, études techniques sur l'horlogerie à l'exposition de 1867. And I would like to just read a few passages from this publication because it's really interesting. Fabrication des ressorts moteurs. Monsieur Montandon, frères, Paris. Les anciens procédés usités pour la fabrication des ressorts de horlogerie donnaient généralement de bons produits, mais la lenteur de l'exécution, l'emploi unique de la main de l'ouvrier ne permettent guère à cette industrie de suivre la voie du commerce moderne qui exige la production rapide et une réduction des prix en temps réel. C'est ce qu'avaient compris deux fabricants français, messieurs Montandon, et c'est à l'intelligence et à l'énergie de ces deux exposants que la France doit de posséder l'établissement du genre le plus considérable de tous ceux qui existent aujourd'hui. Pour bien comprendre le mérite de ces éminents industriels, il faut se placer au point de vue de la grande production et se rappeler qu'ils sont parvenus par l'emploi judicieux des machines qu'ils ont inventées ou perfectionnées à fabriquer des ressorts supérieurs à tous les produits similaires, de prix égal, particulièrement ceux des pays étrangers. Nous ne pouvons donner les descriptions des etc. So this is very interesting. Facts are related in this, and I highly recommend. This is from pages 65 to 72. They do continue, and we do see here that the products are fabricated. Going three quarters of the production were going to England, America, and Germany, and only a quarter of the end results, these products produced, were going to France, Spain, Holland, and Italy. Les produits de Messieurs Montandon se divisent en deux séries, les ressorts de pendule et les ressorts de montre, et se rattachent de la sorte à beaucoup de fabrications importantes et utiles. Ils fournissent en effet d'abord les ressorts pour pendule de Paris, pendule anglaise et à fusée, pendule de la forêt noire, de Vienne, de Berlin, les télégraphes, chronomètres anglais, lampes mécaniques, cartels musique, tourne-broche, instruments de chirurgie, irrigateurs, etc. Puis les ressorts pour montre à encre, à cylindre, etc. pour fusée ordinaire et auxiliaire, métronome, instruments de musique, réveil, etc. So basically, they are producing springs for both clocks and watches, and very important other applications for springs, such as the telegraph machines use also these springs. Lamps, mechanical lamps use these springs. English chronometers, music machines, turn brooches, some sort of mechanized small brooches, instruments of surgical instruments and implements, irrigators, and also anchor and cylinder watches, fusee, ordinary fusees and auxiliary fusee watches, and also metronomes, musical instruments of various sorts, and alarm clocks. So this is a large variety of springs which they're producing for various different appliances as well. And this would also later go to include springs in cameras, which is very interesting, and also in toys, wind-up toys. So I will complete or finish with the conclusion, which is interesting, which Monsieur Saunier relates to us. Ce rapide exposé des principales opérations à suivre pour la confection d'un resort, surtout si l'on remarque qu'elles sont le fait de machines aussi nombreuses que ingénieusement disposées fait bien ressortir et le mérite des chefs de cette importante fabrique et les difficultés qu'ils ont eu le courage d'aborder et le talent de surmonter. La médaille d'or qui leur a été décernée est de celle qu'on peut dire bien gagnée. So this is an incredibly difficult feat which they have achieved in their efforts, and he concludes that the gold medal which they won at the Paris 1867 show was well deserved. To conclude our summary, the Montandon frères established a factory which became the largest and most well-known watch and clock spring factory in the world, and it was not only the most well-known, but it was the highest quality producer at its own time. It managed very early, by 1866, to produce 800,000 pendulum clock springs and 2 million watch springs. And of course, this is an unheard of amount of production if you think of Europe in the 1860s. So it is very interesting to have observed their journeys from 1818 up until the final demise in 1918 for this curious brand. This is another note for the record, and thank you for your attention.